She was supposed to be packing her bags. Instead, Coulter Hayes found Eleanor Ashcroft standing in the frozen yard at dawn, swinging an axe like she'd been doing it her entire life, which she most certainly had not. Every neighbor in the valley had already placed their bets. Refined Eastern woman, dead uncle's ranch, first hard frost. They gave her 6 weeks, maybe 8 if she was stubborn. Coulter had come to be polite, to offer fair money for the land, to save her from a mistake she didn't even know she was making. He never expected to be the one who needed saving. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far across the world this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The morning Coulter Hayes rode out to Ashcroft Ranch, the sky over Wyoming looked like a bruise that hadn't finished forming. Purple-gray at the edges, dirty yellow where the sun was trying and failing to break through. It was the kind of sky that old ranchers read like a newspaper. What it said that morning wasn't good. He'd been putting off this ride for 2 weeks. Frank Ashcroft had been in the ground for 22 days, buried on the hill behind his own barn, the way he'd always said he wanted. And in those 22 days, Coulter had found 17 different reasons not to make the 4-mile trip east to check on the man's niece. He told himself he was busy. He told himself she probably had people handling things. He told himself that a woman who grew up in Philadelphia wouldn't last long enough in Wyoming to require much checking on. But Frank had been his neighbor for 11 years. More than that, Frank had been the kind of man who showed up when your barn roof caved in under 3 feet of snow, who left a side of elk on your porch when you'd had a bad season, who sat with you through long dark nights without needing to say anything at all. A man like that deserved to have someone look in on his family, even family that had no business being here. Coulter's horse, a big gray gelding named Trick, picked his way along the frozen creek bed with the mechanical patience of an animal that had learned not to argue with its rider. Coulter rode with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, one eye on the sky and one eye on the trail. The temperature had been dropping since midnight. The grass on either side of the path was stiff with frost, every blade encased in its own thin glass sleeve, and Coulter's breath came out in steady white clouds that the wind immediately tore apart. He smelled wood smoke before he saw the ranch house. That was the first thing that surprised him. He'd half expected to find the place dark and cold, the windows already empty-eyed the way abandoned buildings got in winter. Instead, smoke was rising straight and strong from the chimney, bending only slightly where it hit the upper air, and there was a light in the kitchen window. Real lamplight, warm and steady. Not the flickering panic of someone who didn't know what they were doing. The second thing that surprised him was the sound. Crack. He heard it before he cleared the last stand of cottonwoods. A clean, sharp report, like a rifle shot but rhythmic. Regular. Crack, crack, crack. He came around the tree line and pulled Trick to a stop. There she was. Eleanor Ashcroft stood in the side yard between the woodpile and the barn, wearing a man's canvas jacket 3 sizes too large for her, her dark hair pulled back with something that might have been a kitchen rag. She had a splitting maul raised above her head, a full-sized one, the kind that weighed 8 pounds easy, and she brought it down on a round of pine with her whole body, hips rotating, shoulders dropping, the blade striking exactly at the point where the grain was weakest. The round split clean in half. She kicked both pieces aside, set up another round, and swung again without pausing to rest. Coulter sat on his horse and watched for a moment longer than was strictly polite. He wasn't watching because she was a woman doing a man's work. He was watching because she was doing it right, and that didn't fit with the picture he'd already drawn of her in his head. He'd been carrying that picture for 2 weeks. The pale, overwhelmed city woman, hands soft from a life of drawing rooms and social calls, standing helpless in the middle of Frank's rough yard and looking at a Wyoming winter like it was something that had happened to her personally. The woman in front of him did not look helpless. She looked tired. He could see that much even from 30 yards. There were shadows under her eyes dark enough to be bruises, and the way she reset her feet between swings had the careful quality of someone working through muscle soreness. But tired and helpless were 2 completely different things, and Coulter was experienced enough to know the difference. He touched his heels to Trick's sides and rode into the yard. Eleanor heard the hoofbeats and turned. She didn't startle. She just turned, the maul hanging easy from her right hand, and looked at him with a pair of gray eyes that were steadier than he'd expected and considerably less friendly. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He pulled Trick up 6 feet away and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Ashcroft." "You're late," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, my uncle spoke of you often." She set the maul head down against the chopping block and straightened. "He said if anything ever happened to him, his neighbor Coulter Hayes would be out to offer condolences within a week. It's been 3 weeks." "I've been busy," she said. "I assumed." The word didn't have any particular edge to it, but it didn't have warmth either. It was just a word she had decided was accurate. "Are you here to check on me, or are you here to make an offer on the property?" Coulter felt the back of his neck go hot under his collar, which was an experience he hadn't had in quite a few years. He was not a man who got flustered easily. He'd argued with cattle buyers, negotiated with railroad men, survived 3 different confrontations with a neighbor to the south who had a habit of moving fence lines. He was not the kind of man whose composure got rattled by a woman with a splitting maul. "Both, I suppose," he said, which was the honest answer, and he figured she'd appreciate honest more than polished. Something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, more like a slight recalibration. She looked at him for another moment, then looked at Trick with what appeared to be genuine interest. "That's a well-built horse," she said. "He is." "Quarter horse?" "Mostly, some Morgan." She nodded, seeming to file this away. "I'll put coffee on," she said, and walked toward the house without looking back to see if he followed. The inside of Ashcroft Ranch's main house was something Coulter hadn't been inside since the summer before Frank died, when they'd shared a bottle of whiskey and a long argument about the railroad's right-of-way through the eastern corner of the property. He'd expected it to feel different with Frank gone, smaller, maybe, or emptier. Instead, it felt occupied in a way it hadn't even when Frank was alive. There were things on the table, papers, a hand-drawn map with notes in 2 different kinds of handwriting, a dog-eared copy of something called Practical Cattle Management, with a dozen slips of torn paper marking pages. The wood stove in the corner was burning hot and even. The coffee pot was already on. Eleanor hung the oversized jacket on a peg near the door and moved to the stove without ceremony. She was smaller than she'd looked outside, or maybe it was just that the jacket had made her seem larger. She was wearing a plain gray wool dress with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, and her hands as she moved the coffee pot were red-knuckled from the cold and from work. City women's hands didn't look like that. Coulter took his hat off and held it, not sure where to put it. There was a rack near the door, but it felt presumptuous to use a dead man's peg. "Sit down," Eleanor said with her back to him. "You're making the room anxious." He sat at the kitchen table. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 18 days. "You came fast." "I came as soon as I got word." She poured 2 mugs and set them on the table, then pulled out the chair across from him and sat in it with the directness of someone who didn't waste time arranging herself. "I was the only family he had left. The law office in Laramie forwarded the letter." "The ranch is in good shape," Coulter said, meaning it. "For 3 weeks with no one managing. My uncle left detailed notes." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He was organized, more organized than most people gave him credit for." "I know, Frank was a careful man." Something crossed her face when he said Frank's name. It was quick, and she controlled it quickly, but it was real. Grief had a particular quality that couldn't be faked, and Coulter had seen enough of it, in mirrors mostly, to recognize it in someone else. "You knew him well," she said. "It wasn't a question. Well enough. He helped me through a bad season 4 years back. I never forgot it." Eleanor looked at her coffee. "He was the only person in my family who ever treated me like I had a working mind," she said, in the careful tone of someone choosing their words with both hands. "My parents died when I was 12. After that I moved between relatives. Most of them were kind enough. None of them quite knew what to do with me." She paused. "Frank wrote letters every month, real letters. He asked questions and then actually waited for the answers." Coulter didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. He just let the words sit there, which was the only decent thing you could do with that kind of truth. After a moment, Eleanor looked up. "You want to buy the ranch?" "I want to talk about your options." "Yes." "And my options are sell to you or sell to someone else. Your options are sell or stay." He set his mug down. "I won't pretend I have no interest in the land. Frank's north pasture borders my east fence line. It's good grazing ground, and I could use it. But I'm not here to pressure you. He looked at her steadily. I'm here because Frank would have wanted someone to tell you the truth about what you're taking on. Tell me then. Winter here isn't a season, he said. It's a siege. The temperature drops to 20 below and stays there for weeks. Blizzards come in off the mountain with no warning and no mercy. Roads close. Creeks freeze solid enough to lose cattle through. Men who were born here and have ranched their whole lives lose livestock every winter. Good men. Experienced men. He paused. A woman who grew up in Philadelphia alone, managing 160 acres with no help and no history here, the odds aren't good, Miss Ashcroft. I'm telling you that plainly because Frank would have wanted someone to. She listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the wood she'd been splitting. Then she looked back at him. How much snow fell last February? She asked. He frowned. Last February? On average, how many inches? 31 inches in one storm, more total. She nodded. My uncle's journal, February entry, 3 years ago. He notes 31 inches in 4 days, lost 2 calves but saved the rest by moving them into the main barn 24 hours before the storm peaked. She picked up her coffee again. He calculated that moving them any later would have cost him 7 animals instead of 2. He says, and I'm quoting, moving cattle is about reading weather and reading animals, not about muscle. A person who pays attention can do this work. He underlined pays attention. Coulter looked at her. I have been reading his journals, Eleanor said, for 18 days. Every entry he wrote for the last 11 years. I have his records for livestock, for weather, for pasture rotation, for feed costs, for everything. I don't know this land yet. She said this without any defensiveness. I know that. I am not pretending to know things I don't know, but I intend to learn, and I intend to stay, and I would appreciate it if you made your offer on the land now so that I can decline it, and we can move on to being neighbors instead. Coulter stared at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time in a very long time, he almost smiled. $2,000, he said. Fair market. No, thank you, she said. No hesitation. I didn't need to hesitate. She stood and refilled his mug without asking. I'm not selling, Mr. Hayes, but I'll gladly take any practical knowledge you're willing to share about the land, the weather, the cattle, things my uncle didn't write down or things you've learned yourself. She sat back down. Would you be willing to do that? In exchange, I'll be a good neighbor. I'll respect your fence lines, I won't let my cattle wander, and if you ever need an extra hand, I'll come. He looked at her across Frank Ashcroft's kitchen table. This woman with her red-knuckled hands, and her dead uncle's journals, and her 18 days of alone in a place that had broken stronger people than her, and he thought about saying something else. Some other argument about sense and reality, and the specific cruelty of a Wyoming winter. He had several prepared. He didn't say any of them. All right, he said instead. I'll share what I know. The Valley had opinions about Eleanor Ashcroft within a week of her arrival, and opinions had a way of spreading in a place with few enough people that everyone knew which horse belonged to which ranch from half a mile away. Pete Gunderson, who ran the general store in the small settlement of Cutter's Crossing 4 miles west, told 3 different customers that the Ashcroft girl was going to sell before November. He said it with the confident authority of a man who had watched 30 years of homesteaders fail. He wasn't cruel about it. He was just honest in the way that people who've seen enough repetition get honest, which is to say, without much room left for exceptions. Martha Gunderson, Pete's wife, told Eleanor directly, with considerably more tact but roughly the same message, when Eleanor came in for supplies on her 4th day in the valley. This is hard country, Martha said, folding Eleanor's order with practiced hands. We've seen a lot of people come through with big plans. Most of them are gone inside a year. I appreciate you telling me, Eleanor said, and she said it in a way that was neither dismissive nor wounded. She just took the information and packed it alongside everything else she was gathering. Bill Harker, who owned the spread to the north and had a habit of leaning on fence posts and watching the world with mild contempt, rode by the Ashcroft property on a Tuesday morning and saw Eleanor on the roof of the smaller outbuilding, replacing shingles. He stopped his horse and watched for a full 2 minutes. Then he rode on without saying anything, which in Harker's vocabulary was something close to impressed. The one thing the Valley couldn't quite figure out was Coulter Hayes. He'd gone out to the Ashcroft place. Everyone knew that, because Cutter's Crossing was the kind of place where someone always saw you riding past, and he'd come back without buying the land. This was confusing. Coulter was a practical man. A land opportunity like Frank Ashcroft's North Pasture didn't come along often, and everyone had assumed Coulter would have the deed transferred within a week of Frank's burial. Instead, he went back, not every day, and not with any obvious pattern, but he went back. He spent an afternoon helping Eleanor winterize the water lines that ran to the stock tank, a job that required 2 people and the knowledge of exactly where Frank had buried the pipes, which Coulter had because he'd helped Frank dig them 8 years ago. He went back 3 days later to look at a calf that was favoring its left foreleg, and spent 20 minutes showing Eleanor how to wrap it and what to watch for. He didn't make a production of these visits. He just came, did what needed doing, answered questions when she asked them, and left. Eleanor asked good questions. That was the thing he kept running into, the thing that kept finding him surprised, not because they were sophisticated questions, but because they were precise. She didn't ask vague, anxious questions like, "Do you think this is going to be okay, or should I be worried about?" She asked things like, "At what wind speed do cattle stop grazing and start burning too many calories trying to stay warm? How far in advance can you usually predict a storm of serious size by sky color alone? If I lose power to the barn for a week, what's the most critical order of priority for the animals?" Good questions. Practical questions. The questions of someone who is building a mental model of a system and filling in the gaps methodically. He found himself answering carefully, more carefully than he'd answered questions from anyone in a long time. What Coulter did not do during those early weeks was examine too closely why he kept going back. He told himself it was for Frank. He told himself it was because the situation was genuinely dangerous and he had a responsibility as a neighbor. Both of these things were partly true. He'd been Frank's friend, and Frank had trusted him, and leaving Frank's niece to learn Wyoming entirely through a dead man's journals and her own stubbornness seemed like a poor way to honor that. But there was also the other thing, which he was less willing to name. The other thing was that being around Eleanor Ashcroft was the first time in 4 years that he'd had a conversation that required his full attention. She didn't talk at him. She didn't talk around things the way people did when they were being polite. She said what she meant. She listened when he talked, and she disagreed with him, directly, calmly, without apology, whenever she thought he was wrong. She was wrong about the fence repair on the south end. She'd planned to do it with a 2-post approach that would have worked in softer soil, but was going to pull loose the first time the ground heaved in a hard freeze. He told her so. She argued the structural logic for 4 minutes with her hands moving in the air to illustrate the geometry. He listened and then explained the specific behavior of post-set concrete in freeze-thaw cycles. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're right. Show me the 3-post method." He showed her. She learned it faster than he expected. She was right about the drainage ditch on the north side of the barn. He told her to leave it. Frank had always left it. And she'd said that the angle was wrong and water was going to pool against the foundation every spring thaw. He'd been skeptical. She dug it herself and redirected it over a weekend. He went and looked at it on a Monday morning and stood there for a moment acknowledging to himself that she was right. He didn't tell her she was right. That was his own failure, and he knew it, but he didn't quite know what to do with the feeling yet. The first hard test came in early October. Coulter was working his own east pasture when he heard the sound. Not thunder because it was too rhythmic and too low, more like the ground itself had decided to relocate. He straightened and looked east toward Ashcroft land. Cattle. Running. Not Eleanor's. Her herd was small. 12 head she'd kept from Frank's original stock while she learned what she was doing. This was someone else's cattle, 15 or 20 of them, stampeding down through the gap between the properties, with the blind committed energy of animals that have panicked and are now just running because stopping is harder than continuing. He was on trick and moving before he'd fully thought through why. There was a dry creek bed at the bottom of the slope, 2 feet deep and narrow enough that cattle would cross it without trouble in summer, but wide enough that a stumble could break a leg. He pushed Trick hard around the left flank, coming at the herd from an angle, and began working them before they got to the creek, shouting, whistling, using Trick's body to direct pressure. He got them turned, not easily and not quickly. There were some tense minutes where he wasn't sure it was going to work. but he got them turned, and he had them milling in a confused circle in the flat below the slope when he heard another horse coming from the opposite direction. Eleanor. She came around the right side of the herd on the bay gelding she'd inherited from Frank. Not the most athletic horse in the valley, but she was riding it hard and with more competence than he would have predicted 2 weeks ago. She'd read what he was doing and came in from the other side, cutting off the escape route he hadn't been able to cover alone. Together, they had the cattle contained in 4 minutes. They sat on their horses across from each other over the milling herd, both of them breathing hard. Eleanor's hat had come off somewhere in the chase, and her hair was half out of its knot, and she had a long scratch down her left forearm where she'd apparently gone too close to some brush. "Whose cattle?" she called across. "Harker's, I think," Coulter called back. "The brand's covered in mud. Can't read it. There's a gap in Harker's north fence. I saw it Tuesday." "You didn't mention it to him." "I sent a note," she said. "He didn't reply." Coulter looked at the cattle, then back at her. "All right?" Eleanor looked at her arm, seemed to notice the scratch for the first time. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Fine." He paused. That was good writing. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pleased, exactly. More like someone who'd just confirmed something they'd suspected. "Thank you," she said. "How do we get them back to Harker's property?" They drove the cattle back together, through the gap in Harker's fence, and Harker came out of his barn to watch them do it with an expression of complete astonishment that he didn't bother to hide. He was a big man who wore his skepticism openly and wasn't accustomed to being wrong about people. "That your herd, Mr. Harker?" Eleanor called from the back of her horse. Harker looked at her, then at the cattle, then back at her. "Yes, ma'am. You'll want to fix that north fence before they get out again. There's a 3-post section pulling loose from a freeze in the corner post. I'd get to it before the weekend." Harker blinked. Yes. Thank you. We'll send you the bill for the rope I used on 3 of them," she said pleasantly, and turned her horse toward home. Coulter rode beside her on the way back. For a long stretch, neither of them said anything. The sky had gone from purple bruise to flat gray while they'd been working, and the first few flakes of what might become something serious were starting to drift down, testing the air. "You said Harker didn't reply to your note," Coulter said. "He didn't. He will now." Something that might have been amusement moved through Eleanor's face and was gone. "I expect so." Coulter looked at the sky. "You should check your barn tonight. Temperature's going to drop fast." "I know," she said. "I've been watching that sky since noon." He looked at her. She was watching the clouds with the same focused attention she gave to everything. The books, the fence posts, the sick calf, everything. Like paying attention was a skill she'd decided to be professionally good at. "I was wrong," he said, "about the drainage ditch." Eleanor turned to look at him. She seemed genuinely surprised. Not that he'd said it, but that he'd said it now, like the timing was unexpected. "I noticed you looked at it," she said. "I should have said something then." "Yes," she agreed. "No softening, no, oh, don't worry about it. Just, yes, you should have." He found he respected that more than reassurance would have felt. "My wife," he said, and then stopped, because the word still had a catch in it, even 4 years later, like a nail sticking up from a floorboard that you keep forgetting about and catching your foot on. She was the one who noticed things like that, drainage and angles and why something was set up wrong. I stopped looking after. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "How long ago?" 4 years, coming on 5. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it the way people said it when they actually meant it, not as a social reflex. "The country took her," he said. "Fever. Hard winter. Couldn't get the doctor out in time." He hadn't meant to say that much. It came out on its own, the way things sometimes did when you'd been carrying them alone for long enough. "It's why He stopped. "Why you told me to sell," Eleanor said, without any accusation in it. "Yes." She looked straight ahead at the trail. The snow was falling more steadily now, thin and dry and serious. "I understand," she said, "but I'm not her." "No," he said, "you're not." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence Coulter had sat in since he couldn't remember when. November arrived like a fist. 3 days of sub-zero temperatures, then a day of false warmth that left a crust of ice over everything, then more cold. Coulter's water lines froze twice. He lost a calf he hadn't expected to lose. Healthy animal, just unlucky, caught out in a drop he hadn't anticipated. He found it in the morning and stood over it for a minute with his hat in his hands, doing the arithmetic of what it cost and what he could absorb, the way ranchers always did. Then he moved on, because moving on was the only option. He went to Eleanor's that week to check on the young calf that had been favoring its leg. It was healed, better than he'd expected, and Eleanor had documented the recovery in Frank's style of record-keeping, dates and observations in her own handwriting, now filling the margins of the ledger Frank had started. She'd added a section at the back with her own index, cross-referencing the different cattle by individual markings. Frank just knew them by memory, Coulter said, looking at it. Frank had 11 years. I have 11 weeks. She didn't say it defensively. I need a system until I have memory. Coulter sat with that for a second. It was a logical thing to say. It was also, in a way he couldn't quite put into words, a kind of wisdom. Understanding the difference between what you actually know and what you only think you know. Not everyone could hold that distinction clearly. How are you doing for wood? He asked. I'm ahead, she said. I've been splitting on every clear day. You should be 3 cords ahead minimum. I have 4. He looked at her. By yourself? Bill Harker sent 2 of his men over, she said, after the fence business. I think it was his way of saying thank you without having to say it directly. That sounds like Harker. I figured as much. She poured coffee without asking. She'd long since stopped asking, and he'd long since stopped noting it. He also told them to bring his good maul, which is heavier than mine, which I thought was thoughtful. He's not a bad man, Coulter said, just cautious about new things. Most people are, Eleanor said. She sat across from him and wrapped her hands around her mug in the way she always did, like the warmth was something specific she needed to hold on to. What made you start ranching here? You're not from Wyoming originally. He was faintly surprised she'd noticed. Montana, he said. Came down for a woman, stayed for the land. And she stayed too? She did. Sarah. The name sat easier than it used to. Not easy exactly, but no longer a wound every time. We built the place together. 6 years we worked it before she got sick. He turned the mug in his hands. After she died, I thought about leaving, going back north, starting somewhere that didn't have her in every fence post. But you didn't. But I didn't. Eleanor looked at him. Why? Coulter looked at his coffee for a moment. Because I'd built something real, and leaving would have been easier, which felt like the wrong reason. Eleanor was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, My aunt in Boston told me the same thing about the ranch, that I should sell because staying would be hard. She meant it kindly. But you stayed. Hard isn't the same as wrong, she said. I learned that from my uncle's letters. Outside the window, the November wind found the corner of the house and pushed at it. Not aggressively yet, but with the steady exploratory pressure of something that was eventually going to find every weakness. The lamp on the table flickered once and settled. There's a storm coming, Coulter said. Real one. End of the week, probably. How bad? Don't know yet. Could be manageable. Could be the first big one of the season. He looked at her steadily. You need to make sure your cattle are all accounted for before Thursday. Every one of them within easy reach of the barn. I know, she said. And if it gets bad enough? He paused. If it gets bad, you don't go out alone. You send someone. You ride to my place. You don't try to manage it by yourself. Eleanor looked at him with an expression that was entirely even. I'll manage what I can manage, she said. And I'll ask for help when I need it. That's all I can promise. It was, Coulter knew, the only promise she was going to make. And it was, he thought, though he didn't say this either, probably the most honest promise anyone had made him in a long time. He rode home in the early dark with the wind pushing at his back, and he thought about Sarah, and about Eleanor, and about the difference between protecting someone from a place and teaching someone to live in it. He didn't have it fully sorted out by the time he got home. He unsaddled Trick, checked his own cattle, added wood to the stove, and sat at his table in the quiet for a while. The wind picked up around midnight. He listened to it work at the eaves the way it always did in November, finding the loose places, testing what held. He thought about the woman 4 miles east who was probably lying awake listening to the same wind, reading her uncle's journals by lamplight, filling in the margins with her own careful handwriting. He blew the lamp out eventually and went to bed, but it took him longer than usual to sleep. The week before the storm hit, Eleanor did 3 things that Coulter wouldn't hear about until later, told to him in pieces by different people, each piece settling into place like stones in a wall. The first, she walked the entire perimeter of her property over 2 days, alone, making notes of every place where fence was weak or post was uncertain. She came back with 4 pages of observations and spent 3 evenings in the barn fixing what she could by lamplight, wearing her uncle's old work gloves over a pair of thinner ones to keep her hands from stiffening in the cold. The second, she went to Pete Gunderson's store and bought specific things, not the general supply run of a person stocking up anxiously, but a precise list: extra lamp oil, a particular weight of rope, medical supplies for the cattle that her uncle's notes said you needed in quantity before a hard winter because you wouldn't be able to get them after. Pete Gunderson watched her work through the list with the methodical attention she brought to everything, and he told Martha that night that he might owe the Ashcroft girl an apology, which was a significant statement from a man who hadn't willingly apologized for anything since 1887. The third thing, she moved all 12 of her cattle into the near pasture 3 days before the storm hit, 2 days earlier than Coulter had suggested, because she'd read her uncle's weather entries for November over 11 years, and she'd identified a pattern he noted in 3 of them. A particular way the temperature fell sharply 2 nights before a major storm, and then rose slightly the following day before dropping for good. She'd felt that pattern in the Tuesday night temperature. She'd acted on Wednesday morning. Coulter heard about the first thing from Harker, who'd seen her walking the fence line on his north boundary. He heard about the second thing from Pete Gunderson, who told him with the particular tone of a man revising an opinion he'd held firmly. He heard about the third thing from Eleanor herself, on a Thursday afternoon when he rode over to check her preparation and found the near pasture already full. He stopped his horse and looked at the cattle, then at the sky. Flat white now, the kind of flat white that wasn't winter weather yet but was quietly becoming it, and then at Eleanor, who was coming out of the barn with a bucket. "When did you bring them in?" he asked. "Wednesday morning." "I said Thursday." "You said Thursday at the latest." She set the bucket down and looked up at him. "I read my uncle's entries for 11 Novembers. 3 of them described what I felt Tuesday night. In all 3, the storm hit Friday. I moved them when I was certain, not when I was scheduled." Coulter sat on his horse for a moment. "I also," Eleanor said, "fixed the latch on the barn's east door, which was going to fail in a hard wind, and I found where your fence line meets mine at the northeast corner. The post there is leaning 4 degrees south. Might hold, might not." "I know about that post," he said. "Do you want help fixing it?" "I can manage." "I didn't ask if you could manage," she said, with the mildest possible patience. "I asked if you wanted help." He looked at her. The wind had picked up while they were talking. It kept doing that lately, showing up in the middle of conversations like a reminder of what was coming. The flat white sky was getting heavier above the western ridgeline. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I'd appreciate the help." They fixed the corner post that afternoon, Coulter driving while Eleanor steadied and Eleanor checking the angle at every stage until Coulter, who had always done this kind of work alone, understood what it meant to have a second pair of eyes. They finished with an hour of daylight left, stiff-fingered and not saying much, and stood looking at the result with the combined satisfaction of something done right. "That'll hold," Eleanor said. "Yes." He picked up the tools. "Thank you." She nodded, pulling her gloves back on. "The storm comes tonight or tomorrow." "I think tonight." "Probably tonight." "Then I should get back." "You should." She walked toward her horse. Coulter watched her for a second. The straight-backed, purposeful walk of someone who'd made all the decisions she could make and was satisfied with them. And he had the strange experience of a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Not nostalgia exactly, something more like recognition. He rode home in the failing light, checked everything twice, and went inside just as the first serious snow began to fall. The storm hit at 9 o'clock, and it hit with everything it had. By midnight, the wind was driving the snow sideways against every surface of the ranch house, and Coulter sat at his table with a cup of coffee going cold and listened to the howl of it, that specific sound that wasn't quite a sound. It was more like the world reducing everything to a single, undeniable voice. He thought about Eleanor's cattle, already in the near pasture, already accounted for. He thought about the corner post, fixed and plumb and solid. He thought about a woman 4 miles east who had read 11 years of a dead man's weather notes and moved on what she knew, 2 days before anyone told her to. Outside, the storm continued building itself into the hardest thing Wyoming had to offer. Inside, 4 miles apart, two ranchers waited for morning. The storm lasted 41 hours. Coulter knew this because he counted them, not obsessively, but the way a rancher always counted hard weather, marking time against what it was costing him and what it might still cost. 2 of his fence posts on the west line went down before midnight of the first night. He found them in the morning gray, snapped at the base by the wind load, wire twisted and sagging into the snow. He lost 3 days of work getting them back up alone, his breath freezing on his collar, his hands going from cold to numb to that particular burning that meant they were coming back and he should be grateful for it. Eleanor lost 1 post. The corner post they'd fixed together held. He found this out when he rode over on the 3rd day after the storm broke. The sky scrubbed pale and transparent the way it got after a serious blow, the kind of clean that looked beautiful and was actually just exhaustion. Eleanor was in the yard when he arrived, not splitting wood this time, but repairing the hinge on the barn door that the wind had pulled half off its frame. She had the door propped with the length of timber and was drilling new holes with a brace and bit, her jaw set with the particular expression of someone doing a job they'd never done before and refusing to let that be a problem. She looked up when he rode in. "Post held," she said, before he could ask. "I know. I checked it from my side." She went back to drilling. He got off his horse, tied Trick to the fence, and came over to look at the hinge situation. It was salvageable. The wood around the original screws had torn out, but there was solid material 3 inches to the left. "Drill it there," he said, pointing. She looked, assessed, nodded, and moved the bit without comment. He held the hinge plate flat while she drilled, and they finished the job in 20 minutes without needing to talk much. That was the thing about working alongside Eleanor. She didn't fill silence with noise. She let the work be quiet when the work should be quiet. "How are your cattle?" he asked when she was testing the door's swing. "All 12. No injuries." She pushed the door open and closed twice, checking the feel of it. "One of them, the older roan cow, the one my uncle called Matilda, she was off her feed for 2 days. I think the stress of the storm. She's eating now." "Matilda," Coulter repeated. "Frank named her after his mother." Eleanor looked at him with brief surprise. "I didn't know that." "He told me once. 3 drinks in, so he wasn't being sentimental about it on purpose." Something warm moved through Eleanor's expression. Not quite a smile, but a kind of grateful recognition, like a piece of a puzzle finding its place. "I'll remember that," she said. She invited him in for coffee, which had become the standard punctuation at the end of any working visit. He went in and sat at Frank's table, which he was gradually starting to think of as Eleanor's table, not because Frank's presence had faded from the room, but because Eleanor had layered her own presence over it. The open ledger, the notes in 2 handwritings, the almanac with the cracked spine she'd clearly been reading in bad weather, the small tin of pencils lined up at the table's edge with an orderliness that was purely hers. "Pete Gunderson told me something interesting," Eleanor said, setting down his mug and sitting across from him. "What's that?" "He said you lost 3 fence posts in the storm." "2?" "He said 3. Pete Gunderson wasn't on my property. It was 2. He picked up the coffee. "What else did Pete tell you? That you're the best rancher in the valley, and you don't accept help from anyone, and you've been that way since your wife died." She said it without hesitation, the way she said most things, directly, and then watching to see what it did. He didn't mean it as a criticism. He said it like a fact. Coulter was quiet for a moment. "Pete talks too much." "Small towns usually do." Eleanor wrapped her hands around her own mug. "Is it true?" "Which part?" "The part about not accepting help." He considered the hinge they'd just fixed together and didn't answer, which was an answer in itself, and he knew it. "I'm not trying to analyze you," Eleanor said, with the mild patience that meant she understood she'd pushed an edge and wasn't retreating from it, but wasn't pushing further either. I'm trying to understand how this valley works. Who helps who, and why, and what it costs to ask. It costs differently for different people, he said. For men who've been here a long time, asking means admitting something went wrong that you should have prevented. It's pride, mostly, not the good kind. And for women who've just arrived? For you, it costs nothing, because everyone already thinks you're going to fail. Asking for help is just confirming what they expect. Eleanor absorbed this. That's a strange kind of freedom, she said. It is, he agreed. Use it while you have it. She looked at him. What changed it for you? The not asking. He opened his mouth to say something deflecting. Nothing. It didn't change. I managed fine. And then stopped because she had a way of making deflection feel more dishonest than it was worth. Sarah used to say I built walls around problems instead of solving them, he said. She was right. After she died, I just kept doing it. Easier to work alone than to let anyone see where things were hard. But you came here, Eleanor said, every week, to help. That's different. Is it? He didn't have a clean answer for that. He turned the mug in his hands. The fire in the stove popped and settled and popped again. Outside, the cleared sky was already beginning to thin toward another cold front. That was November in Wyoming, never quite letting you believe one storm was the last. I was honoring Frank, he said finally. At the start, Eleanor said. Yes, but you've been back 8 times now. He looked at her. She held his gaze without any particular self-consciousness, which was one of her qualities that he'd initially read as boldness and had gradually come to understand was just honesty. She looked at things straight because looking away required a kind of social performance she had no interest in. You're not easy company, he said, which was not quite what he'd meant to say. No, she agreed. I've been told that. I didn't mean it badly. I know. You meant that I ask inconvenient questions. A very slight curve at the corner of her mouth. My uncle said the same thing. He loved me for it. He thought about Frank. Frank with his careful records and his patient letters and his specific way of seeing the value in things other people overlooked. And he thought that, yes, Frank would have loved her for exactly that. The valley had started its revision of Eleanor Ashcroft somewhere around the cattle drive, the day she and Coulter had pushed Harker's stampeded herd back through the gap in the fence, and she'd told Harker to send her a bill for the rope. That had spread the way stories spread in small communities, picking up detail as it moved until, by the time it reached the far end of the valley, it included elements that hadn't happened but probably should have. The core of it was accurate enough. She'd ridden hard and fast into a problem that wasn't hers, fixed it alongside Coulter Hayes of all people, and come out the other side without making it into a story. That last part mattered. People who were proving something made noise about it. Eleanor didn't make noise. Bill Harker sent the lumbermen over after the rope incident, but he also, 2 weeks later, stopped by himself, unannounced, on a Wednesday afternoon, and stood in the yard looking at the barn roof with the expression of a man who was about to offer information he normally kept to himself. That east side's gonna leak come spring thaw, he said. Eleanor looked up at the roof. The 3rd and 4th panels. Harker blinked. You've been up there. Last week. I can't fix it until spring, but I know where it's going to go. Harker stood there for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. My oldest boy knows roofing, he said. When the weather breaks in April, I could send him over. I'd appreciate that, Eleanor said. I'll pay him fair. You don't need... I'll pay him fair, she repeated pleasantly. Harker's mouth shut. He nodded slowly. Fair enough, he said. And then he rode home, and 2 days later sent over a wheel of hard cheese with no note attached, which everyone in the valley understood was Harker's version of an apology and a welcome. Martha Gunderson came out on a Saturday with her daughter Clara, ostensibly to return a pot Eleanor had left at the store, a pretense so thin it was essentially transparent, and stayed for 3 hours helping Eleanor identify which of Frank's preserved goods were still safe to eat. Martha knew preservation, and Eleanor's knowledge of it was purely theoretical. They worked through the cellar together, Martha teaching and Eleanor taking actual notes, and Clara, who was 17 and had been brought along under the theory that she'd be bored, ended up asking Eleanor so many questions about Philadelphia that Eleanor eventually sat on an overturned crate and answered them properly while Martha finished the evaluation herself. She's not what I expected, Martha told Pete that night. No, Pete said. He was quiet for a moment. She's better. What none of them said directly, but all of them felt, in the way that communities feel things before they name them, was that Eleanor Ashcroft was holding on to something more than a ranch. She was making an argument, not with words, because she wasn't the kind of person who argued with words when she could argue with results, but a real one made of fence posts and preserved goods and cattle driven back through gaps in other people's fences. The argument was, I am here. I am capable. And this land does not own me. The valley was listening, slowly, the way it always listened, skeptically, and then with surprise, and then with something that wasn't quite respect yet, but was moving in that direction. Coulter watched this happen from close enough to see the details, and far enough to still pretend, to himself, that he wasn't watching. December hit with a cold so deep and dry it made November look like a suggestion. The kind of cold that got into the gaps in the logs and found the places where the insulation wasn't quite right and laid its hands flat on everything. Coulter's cattle needed extra feed because they were burning calories just standing still. He did the twice-daily rounds, wrapped in every layer he owned, moving fast, not stopping because stopping invited the cold in. He rode to Eleanor's on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into December, not because anything specific had pulled him there, but because the cold had been building for a week, and he wanted to see with his own eyes that the barn was holding. That was what he told himself. He'd been telling himself variations of this for long enough now that the story had some wear on it, but he hadn't yet gotten to the place of replacing it with a more accurate one. Eleanor was in the barn when he arrived. He could hear her before he got through the door. Not because she was loud, but because she was talking. He stopped just inside the barn door and discovered she was talking to Matilda, the roan cow, the one Frank had named after his mother. Eleanor was leaning on the stall rail with her chin in her hand, having what appeared to be a patient one-sided conversation. I know, she was saying, it's cold. It's going to keep being cold. That's Wyoming. You've lived here your whole life, so this is not new information. A pause, as if Matilda had responded. I don't have better news for you. I'm sorry. What I can tell you is that the hay is good quality and the water's not frozen, and that's more than a lot of cattle have tonight. Matilda shifted her weight and made a low, vaguely dissatisfied sound. Yes, Eleanor said. I agree, but complaining about it won't warm either of us up. Coulter stood in the barn doorway long enough to be certain this was actually happening. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to it that it surprised him. Eleanor turned. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked like someone caught doing something perfectly reasonable. She was anxious, she said. Talking helps. Does it help her or you? Both, probably. She straightened and brushed straw from her sleeve. The others are fine. Matilda's just a complainer. He walked into the barn. It was warm in the particular close way of barns in deep cold, animal heat and stacked hay, and the smell of things living that was one of the less romantic aspects of ranching, but one of the most reassuring. He checked the water tank, checked the hay quality by handling, walked the stalls. Everything was in good order, better than good. The stall bedding was fresh and deep. The air in the barn had the circulation that prevented respiratory problems in penned cattle. The light was positioned correctly. Who taught you the bedding depth? He asked. Uncle Frank's notes. He was specific about it. He was right. He stopped at the far end of the barn and looked back toward the entrance. This is solid work, Eleanor. She had learned in the weeks they'd been doing this to accept a compliment without deflecting it. She just said thank you and meant it, which was rarer than it should have been and more valuable than she probably knew. I want to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer honestly, not carefully. He turned. All right. Am I missing something? Something obvious that I can't see because I don't have the history here? She said it with the controlled vulnerability of someone asking a question they'd been building up to and hadn't quite finished worrying about. I read the notes. I watch everything. I ask questions when I can. But there are 11 years of knowledge in the ground here that I don't have, and I'm aware that I might be missing something I don't even know to look for. He thought about it seriously because she'd asked for honesty, and she'd earned it. He thought about what he'd seen over weeks of visits, what the barn looked like, and the cattle and the fences and the way she'd handled every difficulty that had come at her. The creek, he said. What about it? The South Fork of Ashcroft Creek, about half a mile below the house. In a bad winter, it backs up. Frank used to clear the jam in January every year without fail. If it backs up, it floods the low pasture, and if the low pasture floods and then freezes, you lose that ground for spring grazing. Eleanor was already at the doorway, looking south as if she could see the creek through the walls. He didn't write about that, because it was muscle memory. He'd been doing it so long he didn't think to write it down. When in January? Third week, usually. Depends on the snow load up on the ridge. She nodded, turning back. I'll mark it. She pulled the small notebook from her coat pocket. She'd started carrying one, Coulter had noticed, somewhere in November, and wrote in it with the pencil stub that lived in the same pocket. What else? He thought again. The Harker fence on your north boundary. It's his responsibility, but he's slow about it. If cattle get through onto your land in spring, document everything, dates, numbers, which animals. He won't dispute a written record. She wrote that down too. What else? I think that's the critical list. The rest I don't know that you're missing. He paused. You pay attention. That covers a lot. She looked up from the notebook. Something in her expression was quieter than usual. Not softer exactly, but less defended. Like the barn's warmth and the low sounds of the cattle and the specific weight of the honest conversation had made the room smaller and more true than outside rooms usually got. You're a better teacher than you think you are, she said. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He wasn't sure what to do with that. It landed somewhere it wasn't entirely expected. Frank thought so too, she said. He wrote about you. In the journals. Did he? He said you were the kind of man who knew a great deal and told you almost none of it unless you asked. A pause. He meant it kindly. He said some people are like water. They find their own level. And some people are like wells. They have what you need, but you have to go down after it. Coulter stood in the middle of Frank Ashcroft's barn, in the deep of a Wyoming December, with the cold pressing at every wall and the cattle shifting in their stalls, and the roan cow making her low, dissatisfied sounds, and something turned in his chest that he hadn't felt turn in a long time. Not romance, or not only that, not yet. It was more like the specific ache of being seen by someone who had no particular reason to see you and had gone ahead and done it anyway. We should check the creek, he said. Now? Tomorrow. If the temperature lifts 10 degrees. I'll show you where the jam forms. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. Tomorrow. Outside, the Wyoming dark was total and deep and cold enough to sting. Coulter rode home by the stars, which were blazing and brittle-looking the way they got when the air was thin with cold. He'd stopped telling himself stories about why he kept coming back. He hadn't replaced them with any other story yet. He was just riding, in the dark, through the cold, 4 miles home from a woman who'd read 11 years of his dead neighbor's journals and learned to talk to cows and asked questions he didn't have easy answers to. It was enough for now. The rest of it could wait for a warmer season. He unsaddled Trick and went inside and sat at his table and didn't light the lamp for a while. Just sat in the dark listening to the wind and not thinking about anything in particular, which was itself a kind of thinking he hadn't done in years. They checked the creek on a Thursday, when the temperature lifted just enough to make the ride bearable without making it comfortable. Coulter showed Eleanor the bend where the ice always jammed, a place where the South Fork narrowed between 2 old cottonwood roots, and the current slowed enough that debris collected and froze solid over the course of a hard January. Frank had cleared it every year with a long-handled pike, and the patience of a man who understood that ignoring small problems in winter was how you created large ones in spring. Eleanor stood on the bank and looked at the bend for a long time without saying anything. The ice was already forming at the edges, gray-white and thin, not dangerous yet, but building toward it. How long does it take to clear, she asked. Hour, maybe 2. Depends on the accumulation. And if you miss it? If you miss it, the water backs up behind the jam, finds the low path which runs along the south edge of your near pasture, freezes in the pasture, and you lose that ground through April, maybe May. She nodded, still looking at the bend. My uncle came out here in January, even when it was 20 below? Frank came out here in conditions that would have kept most men inside. He just dressed for it. Coulter paused. He also complained about it every year loudly to anyone who would listen. Eleanor turned to look at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that meant she was filing something away about Frank, something that added texture to the uncle she'd known mostly through letters and journals. He never complained in his letters, she said. Frank complained to people's faces, not on paper. He said paper was for facts and faces were for feelings. She looked back at the creek. That's exactly something he would say. They stood there for another moment, the cold working at the exposed skin of their faces, the horses standing patient and miserable behind them. Then Eleanor turned and walked back to her horse, and Coulter followed, and they rode back toward the ranch without speaking much, which had become a comfortable thing between them. The silences that didn't need filling. What Coulter didn't tell her that day at the creek was that he'd never shown anyone that spot before. It wasn't a secret. Anyone who knew the property could have found it, but it was the kind of specific knowledge that accumulated in a person over years, the institutional memory of a place, and he'd never had reason to transfer it to someone else. Showing it to Eleanor felt like handing something over. He wasn't sure entirely what. January arrived and the cold settled into the valley like it had always lived there and had merely been visiting other places for a while. Coulter saw Eleanor twice a week through January, sometimes for work reasons, sometimes without a work reason he could identify that he was willing to examine. They fell into a pattern that neither of them named. He arrived, they dealt with whatever needed dealing with. They drank coffee at Frank's table and talked with the particular directness that had been the texture of every conversation between them since the first day. Then he rode home. The valley noticed. Of course it did, though. The valley noticed everything, filtered it through the accumulated assumptions of people who'd known each other for decades, and produced conclusions that were approximately half accurate. Pete Gunderson told Martha he expected Coulter to make an offer on the land again now that it was clear the girl was staying. Martha told Pete he was missing the point, which was her standard position regarding most things Pete said, and was usually correct. Parker kept his own counsel, which was his standard approach to everything but which had lately included regular actual fence maintenance, suggesting Eleanor's comment about the north boundary had worked its way into his thinking. Clara Gunderson, who was 17 and therefore paying attention to different things than her parents, told a friend in a letter that Mr. Hayes had been to the Ashcroft Ranch so many times since October that his horse probably knew the route without being steered, and that Miss Ashcroft had a way of looking at him when his back was turned that was very interesting indeed. Clara was 17 and prone to romanticism, but she was also observant in the way that people on the edges of social situations often were, and she wasn't entirely wrong. Eleanor herself was not given to examining her own feelings in the way that Clara imagined. She was more accustomed to examining facts. The facts were, Coulter Hayes came to the ranch with regularity. She was not sorry when he came. The conversations they had were the best conversations she'd had since leaving Philadelphia, and better than most she'd had there, because Coulter talked about real things and didn't manage what he said to protect her from information she might find unpleasant. She trusted his knowledge of the land completely, and she trusted, increasingly, his knowledge of people, which was slower to show itself but was there. She also noticed that he laughed more than he had in October, not often and not loudly, more like the sound that escaped a person who'd been keeping things locked down and occasionally failed. She'd made him laugh twice in January, once with a dry observation about Matilda's ongoing dissatisfaction with Wyoming as a concept, and once with a story about her first attempt to shoe a horse, which had involved 3 hours, 2 bruised fingers, and a result so structurally questionable that she'd paid the farrier to redo it, and had decided to classify it as a learning experience rather than a failure. He'd laughed both times and then looked mildly surprised at himself, like the sound had gotten out before he approved it. She did not analyze what this meant. She filed it, the way she filed everything, and let it sit. The third week of January, she cleared the creek jam herself. Coulter had told her he'd come and do it with her. She'd said there was no need. He'd said the pike was heavier than it looked and the footing on the bank was unstable, and she should wait. She'd said she'd manage. He'd said, with more edge than he usually had, that she didn't need to do everything alone to prove she could do it. She'd looked at him across the kitchen table and said, very evenly, I know I can do it. I'm not proving anything. I'm going to go clear a creek. You can come if you want company. He'd come. They worked for an hour and 40 minutes in air, so cold it felt like breathing through cloth. The jam was substantial, by 2 feet of layered ice and debris, packed tight at the narrow bend. Eleanor handled the pike with the careful, methodical efficiency of someone who'd thought through the biomechanics before starting, and Coulter worked beside her without taking over, which was something he'd been genuinely working on and was doing better at. They broke it loose in sections, the cold water running fast and black beneath, the freed debris moving quickly around the bend and downstream. When it cleared, Eleanor stood on the bank and watched the water move for a moment, breathing hard and not bothering to hide it. The cold was brutal enough that her hair had frost on it where it escaped her hat. Her arms hurt. She was going to be sore for 2 days. "Good," she said. "Yes," Coulter agreed. He was looking at her, not the creek, and when she turned and caught him at it, he didn't look away, which was unusual. He held her gaze for a second with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between admiration and discomfort, like a man who was reconciling two things that weren't fitting neatly together. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And then, before she could call him on the deflection, "Sarah couldn't have done that." Eleanor waited. "Not because she wasn't capable," he said. "She was capable of a great deal. But she didn't. She wasn't built for this the way you are. She grew up on a ranch, but a mild country ranch, Montana summer ranch. Wyoming in January was always hard for her. She endured it." He stopped. "I spent a lot of years trying to make it easier for her, doing things before she had to, taking on everything I could take on, so she wouldn't have to endure it, so she would be safe." He looked at the creek. "It didn't work. The one thing I couldn't control. Fever. Doctor 12 miles away and road snowed shut." He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had the texture of something he'd said to himself many times in many forms. "I kept thinking afterward, if I had just done more, fixed more things, anticipated better, made the ranch safer somehow." "It wasn't the ranch that killed her," Eleanor said. Not harshly, just plainly, the way she said things that needed to be said plainly. "I know that. Do you?" He looked at her. She held his gaze. "You came here the first day and told me to sell because the land would take me," she said. "But the land didn't take Sarah. A fever took Sarah. Those aren't the same thing." Coulter was silent for long enough that a lesser person might have mistaken it for not listening. Eleanor had learned that it meant he was processing something real. "When you believe the same thing for 4 years," he said finally, "it gets into the walls. Even if it's not exactly right, it gets into the walls." "I know," she said. "I spent 6 years believing I was a burden to everyone who housed me. My aunt was kind, my cousins were kind, but I had no place that was mine, and I started to believe that was my nature rather than my circumstances." She looked at the water moving freely now around the bend. "My uncle's letters were the first thing that argued back. 12 years of letters, arguing against a story I told myself about who I was." Coulter was quiet. Then, "Frank was good at that." "Yes, he was." She turned from the creek and picked up the pike. "I think you might be good at it too, if you let yourself." She walked back to the horses before he could answer, which she'd done on purpose, giving him room to sit with it without having to respond immediately. She'd learned over months that Coulter processed sideways. He'd come at a thing from an angle 3 days later, when he'd had time to turn it over, and whatever he said then would be more true than anything he managed in the moment. They rode back to the ranch in the last of the January afternoon light, which lasted about 20 minutes before the sky went dark blue and cold. Eleanor fed the cattle and Coulter helped without being asked, and they ate together at the kitchen table. Not for the first time, there'd been a handful of evenings when the work had run long enough that going home unfed seemed impractical. And it was an easy meal, the easiness of people who'd stopped performing for each other some time ago. He went home before full dark. She watched him ride out from the porch, the cold coming up around her ankles, and stood there a moment after he'd cleared the cottonwoods. Then she went back inside and sat at the table and opened the ledger and wrote up the creek work in her careful, factual way. Date, time, conditions, what the jam looked like, what tools were needed, how long it took. Frank's style. In the margin, in smaller writing, she wrote, "CH. Knows this land the way you know your own name. Doesn't always know that he knows it." She looked at this for a moment, then closed the ledger and went to bed. February in Wyoming was the month when the valley stopped arguing about winter and started simply enduring it. The cold was no longer new or interesting or a test of anything. It was just the ambient fact of existence, pressing down on everything with a patience that outlasted every human impatience against it. Coulter's mood in February was always compressed, Tighter than other months, because February was when he'd lost Sarah, and the anniversary of it sat in him like a stone, regardless of whether he acknowledged it out loud. He didn't go to Eleanor's for 10 days in early February. He told himself he was busy, which was partly true. He also didn't examine the other part. Eleanor came to him. She appeared on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had climbed to a relatively tolerable 15 degrees, riding Frank's bay with a covered pot tied to the saddle in a way that suggested she'd given some thought to not spilling it. She came into his yard, dismounted, tied the horse to the fence, and carried the pot to the door and knocked on it without any apparent anxiety about whether this was presumptuous. He opened the door in his shirt sleeves, not expecting anyone. "Beef stew," she said, holding the pot out. "From Matilda's cousin, more or less. Don't read into that." He looked at her. "You rode 4 miles in 15-degree weather to bring me stew." "I rode 4 miles in 15-degree weather to check on a neighbor who hasn't been seen in 10 days, she said. "The stew was practical. You eat while I'm here, and I know you've eaten." He stepped back from the door and let her in. She came in and looked around his kitchen with the same observational attention she gave everything, taking in the state of things, the dishes on the counter, the stack of papers on the table, the half-repaired bridle hanging on the chair back. Not judging, just noting. She put the pot on the stove and turned to him. "February?" she said. It wasn't a question. He sat down. "February." She sat across from him the way she always did. The kitchen was warmer than it had been when he was here alone, or maybe it just seemed that way. "My mother died in March," she said. "Every year, when the end of February gets close, I feel it before I know I feel it, like weather." He looked at her. "Your parents both. Influenza. It moved through the neighborhood. They were both gone in a week." She folded her hands on the table. "I was 12. I remember being very practical about it at the time because there was no other option. It was only later, years later, that I understood what I hadn't allowed myself to feel yet." "Years later," he repeated. "Grief isn't always immediate," she said. "Sometimes you carry it a long time before you put it down long enough to actually look at it." She met his eyes. "How long has it been since you put it down long enough to look at it?" Coulter was quiet. The fire in the stove worked steadily. The smell of the stew was filling the kitchen, something ordinary and warming and exactly what February kitchens needed. "I look at it," he said. "I look at it plenty. Looking at it and looking at it are different things." He frowned. "That's the same phrase twice." "No," she said patiently. "One of them means you know it's there. The other means you actually sit with it and let it be what it is." She paused. "My uncle wrote about you in February, 3 years ago. He said you worked yourself to exhaustion every February, every single year. He said he suspected you were doing it so you couldn't think." Coulter's jaw tightened. "Frank observed too much. He was your neighbor for 11 years. What did you expect?" "I expected some privacy." "He never told anyone," Eleanor said. "He wrote it in a journal no one was supposed to read." She looked at him steadily. "And then he left it to me, which I think might have been intentional." Coulter looked at her for a long moment. "Your uncle was a manipulative old man." "Yes," she agreed, with a warmth that was almost a smile. "He was very good at it." She stood and went to the stove to check the stew. "Eat. And then, if you want to talk about Sarah, I'm here. And if you don't, that's fine too. But you should eat." He ate. The stew was good. Not refined, not delicate, just solid and warm and right for the weather and the day. She ate too, across the table from him, and they talked about the cattle and the condition of the roads, and a rumor that the railroad was planning a new spur line that would change the economics of getting beef to market. Practical things. Real things. The kind of conversation that let a person breathe without having to make it mean anything large. Near the end of the meal, he said, without planning to, "She used to make stew in February. It was the one thing I ate reliably this time of year because everything else tasted like nothing." Eleanor didn't make a production of this. She just said, "What else did she cook that was good?" And he told her. He talked about Sarah's cooking, and then about Sarah's habit of singing to herself when she thought no one could hear, and about the way she'd argued with him over the placement of the main gate for 3 weeks until he'd moved it, and she'd been right. He talked about the 6 years they'd had together, and the specific weight of a life that ended before it finished. And Eleanor listened the way she listened to everything, fully, without interrupting, without offering solutions, without the anxious helpfulness that most people brought to grief because they didn't know what to do with it and needed to fill the space. When he finished, the stew was long cold, and the afternoon had gone fully dark outside. He looked at his hands on the table. "I don't talk about her," he said. "Generally." "I know," Eleanor said. "You don't have to do it generally, just when it's right." He looked at her across the table. The lamplight was doing what lamplight always did in winter, making the inside of a room feel more true than it managed in other seasons. She looked back at him with her gray eyes and her red-knuckled hands and the specific quality of her attention that he had never managed to find a single adequate word for. "Thank you," he said, "for coming." "I'm your neighbor," she said simply. "That's what neighbors do." She rode home in the full dark, 4 miles in the cold, and he watched her go from the porch and then stood there longer than the cold justified, looking at the sky. The stars were out in the brittle, blazing way of February stars, every one of them sharp-edged and exactly where it had always been. March came in hard, a late-season storm that felt vindictive, like winter taking one more run at the valley before it finally let go. 3 days of snow and wind followed by a week of freeze-thaw that made the roads treacherous and the creek beds unpredictable. Eleanor's near pasture held dry, which it would not have done if the South Fork had jammed and she hadn't cleared it in January. She noted this in the ledger with the factual satisfaction of a prediction proven out. Coulter came on the first clear day after the late storm and found her in the yard, splitting wood again. Always splitting wood, the way she had been on the very first morning, the maul rising and falling with the same clean efficiency. He sat on his horse for a moment and watched, the way he had on that first day. And he thought about how different the woman he'd ridden toward in October was from the woman he was watching now. Not that Eleanor had changed. She hadn't. Not fundamentally. What had changed was his ability to see what was actually there, instead of the idea of her he'd brought with him as a convenience. She looked up and saw him. She planted the maul in the chopping block and brushed her hands on her trousers. "Creek's running clear," she said. "I know. I checked mine this morning." "How's the east pasture?" "Wet, but solid." He dismounted. "I want to talk to you about something." She waited, which was her standard response to that kind of opening. She didn't prompt or push, just made room. "There's a buyer coming from Cheyenne next month," he said. "He's looking at parcels in the valley. Serious money. He's already approached Harker about the north property, and he's going to approach you." Eleanor's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it settled into a harder alignment. "You're warning me. I'm informing you. There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "He'll come with a very good offer. Better than mine was, probably, and he'll come with a lot of reasons why it makes sense." "Does he plan to ranch it?" "He plans to consolidate it. Break the valley into larger holdings, run cattle at scale, cut the smaller operators out of the market." He paused. "It's legal. It's not uncommon. It will change this valley significantly. And you think he'll try to buy mine because without Frank's north pasture, your property is harder to expand." He looked at her. She'd gotten there faster than he expected, which he probably should have stopped expecting by now. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate. So you have a personal interest in me refusing?" "Yes," he said again. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She held his gaze. "I appreciate you telling me anyway." "You'd have figured it out." "Probably, but you saved me the time." She picked up the maul again and set a new round on the block, and he understood that this was her way of thinking. She worked while she processed, always had. "I'm not selling to a consolidator," she said. "I'm not selling to anyone. But tell me more about him, because if he's coming to this valley, I want to know what I'm dealing with." Coulter told her everything he knew, which was more than she'd have gotten from anyone else because Coulter paid attention to the economics of ranching the way Eleanor paid attention to weather patterns, systematically, without gaps. She listened, split wood, and asked the questions that got at the specific mechanism of how consolidation worked and what tools smaller operators had against it. Not panicked questions. Strategic ones. When he'd told her everything useful, she set down the maul and looked at the wood she'd split. There was a good cord and a half in the pile. "He's going to be disappointed," she said, with a calm matter-of-factness that in a different register might have been called satisfaction. "He is," Coulter agreed. She looked at him. Something was moving in her expression that he'd learned to read over months of watching her face, which was a face that showed less than most people's, but showed truly when it did show. Gratitude? Yes, but something else alongside it. The particular quality of a person who keeps finding that another person is better than their circumstances required them to be. "Stay for supper," she said. "Parker's wife sent over a pie yesterday, and I can't eat a whole pie by myself. He should ride home." He had work in the morning, and the roads were still uncertain, and he'd been telling himself for months that he was going to stop finding reasons to stay at Eleanor's table past dark. "All right," he said. The evening went the way evenings between them had come to go. The food and the fire and the talk that ranged from practical to less practical to the particular territory that existed between two people who had, without planning to, come to know each other well. He left at 8. The roads were solid enough, the stars were out. Riding home, he thought about the buyer from Cheyenne, and about Frank's North pasture, and about all the things that were coming, and under all of that he thought about Eleanor's face in the lamplight when she'd said stay for supper, the simple directness of it, and the way she always made the ordinary things sound like exactly what they were, and no more complicated than that. He was 4 miles home through the Wyoming dark. It wasn't enough distance. The buyer from Cheyenne arrived in April, which was not yet spring in Wyoming, regardless of what the calendar said. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he came in a good coat and a hired buggy, and with the specific confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who couldn't afford to say it. He went to Harker first. Harker told him the North property wasn't for sale and sent him away in under 10 minutes, which surprised Marsh and probably shouldn't have. Harker was stubborn about land the way most Wyoming men were stubborn about land, which was to say completely and without negotiation. Then Marsh came to Eleanor. Coulter wasn't there when it happened. He heard about it from Pete Gunderson, who heard about it from Clara, who had been delivering an order to the Ashcroft Ranch when Marsh's buggy came up the road, and had stayed to watch with the specific attention of a 17-year-old who understood that something worth observing was about to occur. According to Clara, Marsh had offered Eleanor $4,000 for the property. Double fair market, the kind of number designed to make a person feel that refusing was irrational. He'd presented it with the polished reasonableness of someone experienced at this, explaining the economics of consolidation, the difficulty of small-scale ranching, the wisdom of taking good money while good money was being offered. He'd said, Clara reported, that he had great respect for what Miss Ashcroft had accomplished, but that the valley was changing and it was better to sell on your own terms than to be eventually pressed out by larger forces. Eleanor had listened to all of it. Then she'd said, "The fence line runs along the North Creek bed. I want to make sure you understand exactly where the property ends so that when you're looking at other parcels, you don't make any errors about which land is available." And she'd walked him to the fence line and pointed out the boundary markers with complete courtesy and shown him off the property without once raising her voice or saying the word no, because she hadn't needed to. Marsh had come to Coulter afterward, which Coulter had expected. He'd come with a number, a good number, better than the one he'd offered Eleanor. And Coulter had told him that Frank Ashcroft's North pasture wasn't on the market, and neither was any other piece of his property, and that he was welcome to look elsewhere in the territory. Marsh left the valley 2 days later. The valley recovered quickly from his visit, the way small communities recover from outside disturbances, by resuming its normal life and absorbing the incident into its ongoing story. Pete Gunderson told 3 people that the Ashcroft girl had handled Marsh better than anyone. Martha Gunderson said she'd always known the girl had sense. Bill Harker said nothing but sent over a post-hole digger he'd borrowed from Frank 3 years ago and had apparently been meaning to return. Coulter rode to Eleanor's the day after Marsh left. She was in the garden, which was not yet a garden in any producing sense, still mostly turned earth in the careful stakes she'd set up to mark what she intended to plant, but which she'd been working since the first thaw with the same methodical planning she brought to everything. "He came to you," she said, without looking up from what she was doing. "He did. And I told him no, same as you." She looked up then. "How much did he offer?" He told her. She considered this for a moment, doing the arithmetic of what it represented. "That's serious money," she said. "It is. And you said no." "I said no," he confirmed. "This land isn't about the number it could sell for. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that said she understood exactly what he meant and was filing it in the same place as other things he'd said that mattered. Then she went back to her garden work. "Help me with these stakes," she said. "I can't get them straight without a second eye." He spent an hour helping her set garden stakes in the cold April ground, which was not how he'd planned to spend the morning, and which was fine. The work was easy, and the company was good, and the sky over the valley was finally doing something other than threatening. It was actually, cautiously, thinking about becoming spring. They built through April and into May. Eleanor's garden went in, real planting now, seeds she'd sourced carefully through the winter from Pete Gunderson's catalog, varieties her uncle had grown, and varieties she'd researched herself. She'd built a cold frame against the south wall of the house from lumber Harker's son had left over from the roof repair, and she was using it to start seedlings 3 weeks ahead of the open ground season. Coulter looked at the cold frame the first time he saw it and experienced the particular sensation, which had become familiar, of finding that she'd solved a problem he hadn't known was on the table. "Frank never did that," he said. "Frank had more patience with the shortened season than I do," she said. "I want tomatoes before September." "You might actually get them." "I know," she said, without any particular arrogance. "Just, yes, I planned for that outcome." The spring brought other changes. Eleanor hired a hand, a young man named Amos Briggs, 19 years old, the third son of a homestead family from the far south end of the valley, who needed work and came with a genuine willingness to learn and without the particular brand of pride that made some young men impossible to teach. Eleanor interviewed him at the kitchen table with the same directness she applied to everything, asking specific questions about what he knew, and, more critically, she told Coulter later, what he knew he didn't know. He said he didn't know cattle medicine, she told Coulter that evening, but he said it straight, not embarrassed, just factual. "I can teach a person who tells me what they don't know. I can't teach someone who pretends." "Smart hiring," Coulter said. "I learned it from Frank's journals. He wrote that the worst ranch hands were the ones who were afraid to be wrong in front of a woman." She paused. He'd gone through 5 of them before he found one worth keeping. Coulter smiled at that, really smiled, not the almost smile he'd been managing for months. It changed his face in a way that Eleanor noticed and didn't comment on, which was its own kind of kindness. The summer that followed was the best working season Coulter could remember in years. Not because anything went especially smoothly. It didn't. There were equipment failures and a dry stretch in July that stressed the pastures, and a situation with a neighboring cattle operation 2 valleys over that required 3 trips and considerable patience to resolve. But it was good in the way that seasons are good when you're not carrying the weight of them alone. He found himself consulting Eleanor on things he'd always handled by himself, not because he needed her help, but because she saw angles he missed and said so without trying to manage his reaction, and because the back and forth of it was better than the silence of deciding alone. She came to him too. The cattle medicine question, she had a heifer with a respiratory infection in July, and she came to Coulter's ranch at 6 in the morning because he had more experience with it than she did, and she didn't waste time being embarrassed about that. They worked the animal together for 2 hours, and she learned what she could learn from watching and asking, and the heifer recovered. "You should have more animals next year," Coulter said when it was over. "Your grazing land can support 30 head without stress." "You've been cautious." "I've been learning the land," she said. "Now I know it well enough to push it a little." 30 head is a big jump from 12. "I'll go to 20, see how the winter handles it." She washed her hands at the pump. "Would you buy 5 from your herd? I'd rather start with cattle I know the history of." He looked at her. "Which 5? "The young roan and the 4 2-year-olds from your north pasture. I've been watching them all summer. They're solid." He'd been watching her watch his cattle for weeks and hadn't said anything, because watching was what Eleanor did, and it wasn't his place to comment on everything she observed. But she'd been doing this, cataloging his herd, noting which animals were strong and adaptable, with the long-game patience of someone who'd decided on an outcome before she mentioned it to anyone. "Fair price," he said. "Fair price," she agreed. "Frank would have wanted me to pay fair. Frank would have wanted you to drive a hard bargain. Same thing, with the right person." She dried her hands and looked at him. "You're the right person." He sold her the 5 cattle in August and helped her drive them east to her pasture and watched her integrate them into her existing herd with a competence that Amos Briggs clearly admired and tried to emulate. The boy was learning well under Eleanor. He had the same qualities she prized in herself, the willingness to be wrong and adjust. And she was teaching him the way she'd learned, through Frank's method: watch, think, ask, do. Summer gave way to early fall, and the valley turned the particular gold and amber that Wyoming managed for exactly 3 weeks before it went straight to dead brown and then to snow. Coulter and Eleanor fell into the habit of a shared supper twice a week, sometimes at her place, sometimes at his, and the arrangement had grown so naturally out of the practical reality of the shared work that neither of them had ever formally suggested it. It had just become true, the way several things between them had become true without being decided. He was at her table on a Thursday in late September when the sky changed. He noticed it through the kitchen window first. Not a visual change exactly, more of a quality of light, something going flat and wrong in the afternoon the way light did before serious weather. He stood and went to the window. "Eleanor." She came and stood beside him. They both looked west, where the sky above the ridgeline had gone a particular shade, not dark, not stormy in the traditional sense, but a deep, uniform gray-white that moved with a unified purpose that ordinary clouds didn't have. "That's not a regular storm," she said. "No," he said. "That's a wall." The word meant what it described. A wall of weather, the kind that formed in the mountains and came off them fast and total, carrying everything at once, wind and snow and a temperature drop so severe it could take you from cold to dangerous in the time it took to walk from the barn to the house. "My cattle," she said. He was already moving toward the door. "Where are they?" "Amos moved the main herd to the south pasture this morning, for the fall grass." She was pulling her coat on. "The south pasture is open, no windbreak." The south pasture was half a mile from the barn, wide, flat, exposed on 3 sides. In a wall storm, cattle in an open pasture didn't just suffer. They panicked, scattered, ran, and if the temperature dropped fast enough and the snow came in dense enough, they went down. "How long do we have?" she asked. Coulter looked at the wall again. It was moving fast. "An hour, maybe less." She was out the door before he finished the sentence. They rode hard, Coulter on Trick, Eleanor on the bay, and Amos, who had been in the barn and come running when he saw them mount up, on the 3rd horse Eleanor had added to her string in August. They reached the south pasture in 8 minutes. The cattle were already unsettled. Animals could read weather in their bones, and these ones knew something was wrong, milling in the restless circular way that meant the edge of panic was close. The wall was 20 minutes away now, maybe 15. The light had gone entirely flat, and the wind had picked up from nothing to something serious in the time it had taken them to ride here, which told Coulter everything about the speed of what was coming. "Split them," Eleanor called. "Amos, east side. Coulter, cut off the left flank. I'll push the leaders." She went straight at the front of the herd before Coulter could say anything about the sense of it, which was pure Eleanor. She'd assessed and decided and was already doing. She took the bay in hard and fast at the lead animals, using the horse's body and her voice to turn them north, toward the barn, toward shelter. Coulter swung wide and came at the left flank, and Amos took the east side the way she'd said. And they worked the herd together with the specific total concentration of people who understood that there was no margin for error. The wall hit when they were 200 yards from the barn. It didn't build up. It arrived. One moment there was wind and flat light and moving cattle, and the next moment the world went white. Not dark, white, which was worse, because white was disorienting in a way that dark wasn't. The snow came horizontal, driven by a wind that went from serious to savage in the span of a breath. And the temperature dropped so fast that Coulter could feel it through his coat in a way that wasn't just cold anymore, but something more fundamental, like the air itself had changed its nature. He could hear Eleanor. He couldn't see her, she was 6 feet away and invisible. But he could hear her voice working the cattle with a steady, commanding sound that didn't waver. The cattle were scared, but they were moving. That was the critical thing. Moving animals were manageable. Stopped animals were a disaster. Coulter worked by feel and sound, and the muscle memory of 30 years of cattle. He kept Trick moving at the right angle, kept the pressure on the flank, kept his voice going. At one point his horse went sideways in a gust and he nearly came off, stayed on through the kind of physical instinct that doesn't involve conscious thought, got Trick steady again and kept moving. So, dit. The barn materialized out of the white like a promise. The bulk of it visible 3 seconds before they were on it. The big doors already open because Amos had gotten there somehow and pulled them wide. The lead cattle went in and the ones behind followed in the dumb committed way of herd animals following what was in front of them, and the count built in Coulter's head 8, 12, 15, 17. And then Eleanor was there beside him in the barn doorway, both of them turning to face the white nothing outside. "How many?" she said. "I count 17 in. We have 20. 3 short." She started back out. He caught her arm. "Eleanor?" "3 head, Coulter." "It's a wall storm. You go back in that—" "3 head," she said again. She wasn't angry. She was just resolute, in the way she was always resolute, which was without drama and without apology. "Stay with the ones we have. I'll be back in 5 minutes." She went back into the white before he could stop her. He stood in the barn doorway for exactly 4 seconds, which was as long as it took him to understand that he wasn't staying with the ones they had. He went after her. He found her by sound, her voice, calling the cattle, that steady commanding sound she'd developed over a year of working with animals. He came up alongside her, and she didn't tell him to go back. She just moved slightly so they were working the same direction, and together they swept the area where the 3 missing animals would have been when the wall hit, and they found them, 2 together, huddled against the fence line, and the 3rd alone, confused and drifting the wrong way. And they turned them and pushed them forward through the white and the noise and the cold that by now was past discomfort and into something more serious. They came back through the barn door with all 20 cattle. Amos pulled the doors shut behind them and stood breathing hard in the sudden comparative quiet of the barn, looking at them both with an expression that said he'd been genuinely scared they weren't coming back. Eleanor made the count twice with her hand on each animal. Then she stood in the center of the barn and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of motionless relief. Coulter saw it happen, the brief closing of her eyes, the long breath. And then she was moving again, checking animals, checking for injuries, checking the barn structure against the sound of the storm working at it from outside. Coulter stood against the barn wall and watched her, and felt something move through his chest that had been building for a long time and had finally run out of room. He was covered in snow that was already melting in the barn's warmth. His hands were shaking slightly, which he recognized as the come-down from the specific kind of fear that didn't show itself until the danger was past. He hadn't been afraid of the storm. He'd been afraid of Eleanor going back into it and not coming out. That distinction mattered. He understood, standing in the barn with the storm howling outside, and Eleanor checking her cattle with red, careful hands, that he'd passed the place where he could tell himself this was something simpler than what it was. She came back to him when she'd finished the check. She had a cut on her cheek from somewhere, probably a fence wire in the white, and her coat was soaked through and she was shaking with cold she hadn't let herself acknowledge while there was still work to do. He looked at the cut. She looked at his expression. "The cattle are fine," she said. "I know. You didn't have to come back out there." "I know," he said again. His voice came out with less steadiness than he'd intended. She looked at him for a long moment in the dim barn light, with the storm making its noise against the walls and the cattle settling behind her and Amos very deliberately finding things to do at the far end of the barn. Her gray eyes in the low light had the specific quality of someone who was seeing something clearly and deciding whether to say so. "The ranch house is closer than yours," she said. "You should stay until the storm breaks." "Yes," he said. "I should." They ran from the barn to the house through the storm's edge, and inside the warmth hit them like a physical thing. Eleanor put more wood on the fire, and they both stood near it with the animal gratitude of people who've been genuinely cold and are now genuinely warm. Amos stayed in the barn with the cattle, which was the right call and which Eleanor had arranged with 3 words and a look before they'd left. She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and the storm worked at the house outside with a focused hostility that made the inside feel both fragile and deeply necessary. Eleanor had the cut cleaned and a cloth pressed to it. She'd handled it herself without fuss, which was typical. Her coat was hung near the fire, steaming. Her hands, wrapped around her mug, were still red and slightly unsteady. Coulter sat across from her and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her, and he said what he'd been not saying since October. "I was afraid you weren't coming back," he said. "Out there. When you went after the 3. I was afraid. Eleanor was still. She didn't fill the space. Not afraid the way a neighbor is afraid, he said. Afraid the way... He stopped. He was not good at this, had never been good at this, and 4 years of not trying hadn't improved the skill. The way it matters when it's a specific person. She looked at him across the table. The fire popped behind him. The storm pressed at the glass. Coulter, she said. Her voice was even, but not uninvested. There was something under the evenness that he recognized because he'd learned over a year to hear the difference between Eleanor's flat and Eleanor's controlled. I've been sitting across from you at this table for most of a year. I know. You're not a slow man, she said. You've been careful. There's a difference. I know what the difference is. She set her mug down. I'm not fragile, I'm not Sarah, and I'm not a version of this land that needs to be survived. I'm a person sitting across a table from you, and I've been here this whole time. He felt the truth of it settle through him, like the warmth was settling. From the outside in, reaching places that had been cold for longer than one storm. I know, he said. I know exactly who you are. That's the thing. He met her eyes. It took me a while to understand that knowing who you are was the reason, not the obstacle. The storm outside was as loud as it had been. The fire was as warm. Eleanor Ashcroft sat across from Coulter Hayes in her dead uncle's kitchen, which had become her kitchen, which had, without ceremony or announcement, become the place where the truest conversations of the past year had happened. And she looked at him with her steady, undecorated gaze and said, There are 2 ranches. I'm keeping mine. I know, he said, and I won't be managed, or protected from things, or decided for. I know that too. Then tell me what you're actually asking. He held her gaze. I'm asking if you'll let me stand beside you, he said. Not in front, not behind, beside. The storm continued. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, he'd come to understand the difference between her hesitating and her being exact. And then she said, Yes, I think I will. The storm held them there for 2 days. Not trapped. The word implied helplessness, and neither of them was helpless, but held the way serious weather in Wyoming held you, pressing you against the fact of your own smallness relative to the land you'd decided to live on. The roads went under. The visibility outside the windows dropped to 20 feet, then 10, then to the particular nothing of a full whiteout that made the world outside the glass look like it had simply ceased to exist. Amos slept in the barn with the cattle the first night, wrapped in horse blankets, and reported in the morning that all 20 animals were fine, and that Matilda had complained about it steadily until approximately midnight, and then given up, which Eleanor received as good news on both counts. Inside the house, Coulter and Eleanor did what they'd always done. They worked with what was in front of them. They cooked on the wood stove. Eleanor's pantry was well stocked because she'd learned from her uncle's journals that the correct response to a Wyoming winter was to always have more than you thought you needed. They checked the barn twice a day together, moving through the wind in the brief intervals when it dropped enough to make the 20-yard trip feasible. They talked. This was the part that mattered most, and both of them understood it without needing to say so. The conversations that happened in those 2 days had the quality of things long pressurized finally finding a valve. Not dramatic. There was no drama in it, not in the performed sense. Just 2 people who had spent nearly a year being honest about practical things, finally being honest about everything else. Eleanor told him about Philadelphia in a way she hadn't before. Not the facts of it, which she'd mentioned across many previous conversations, but the texture of it. The specific loneliness of being smart in a room that didn't need you to be smart. The way her aunt's house had been genuinely kind and genuinely airless at the same time, like a room with good furniture and no windows. The way she'd read her uncle's letters at the kitchen table after everyone else was in bed, every month for 12 years, and how they'd been the one ongoing proof that there was a place in the world where what she actually was would be useful rather than inconvenient. When the lawyer's letter came, she said, about the ranch, I wasn't sad first. I was sad second. First I thought, this is the thing he left me, the actual thing, not a piece of jewelry or a sum of money, the place where being capable matters. Coulter sat with this. The fire was going well, and outside the storm was in its second act, which was quieter than the first, but no less total. Did you ever think about staying in Philadelphia? He asked. Selling, taking the money, continuing what you'd built there? I'd built nothing there, she said, without bitterness. I'd been maintained. There's a difference. She looked at her hands on the table, still red-knuckled, still marked by a year of actual work, the cut on her cheek already closing into something that would probably scar slightly, and which she seemed entirely untroubled by. The ranch gave me the chance to build something that was mine. I wasn't going to pass that up for comfort. A lot of people would have. A lot of people haven't spent 12 years being careful with someone else's comfort, she said. When you've done that long enough, your own capability starts to feel like a gift you haven't opened yet. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it the way he thought about good things, Eleanor said, by turning them over, looking at the underside, checking whether they held from every angle. They always held. He told her things too, not all at once. That wasn't how he operated, and she understood his particular rhythm by now, the way he came at truth sideways and on his own schedule. But over the 2 days he told her about Montana, about his own family's ranch, and his father's specific brand of silence that he'd spent 30 years trying to either replicate or escape without being entirely sure which he was doing. He told her about meeting Sarah at a stock sale in Helena, how she'd argued with the auctioneer about the condition of a horse being sold and won the argument, and how he'd thought right then that here was a person worth paying attention to. He told her about building the Wyoming ranch together, the specific pride of that, and the specific weight of continuing it alone after. The hardest part wasn't the grief, he said, on the second evening, with the storm finally beginning to thin outside. The hardest part was that the work continued. Every day the fence needed checking, and the cattle needed feeding, and the water lines needed maintaining. The land didn't stop demanding things because I was in pain, and after a while I realized I was grateful for that. He looked at the table. The work held me up. I'd stopped letting anything else do it. Eleanor didn't immediately respond. She had a quality he'd come to value tremendously, which was that she didn't rush to fill the air after something real had been said. She let it sit and be real. Frank wrote that about you, she said finally. Not in those words. He wrote that you were the most capable, lonely man he'd ever known. He said capable people are often lonely because they solve problems before most people realize there's a problem, and solving things alone becomes a habit that's hard to break. Frank should have said that to my face. He probably thought you'd argue. I would have argued, Coulter admitted, and he would have been right, which is worse. The corner of Eleanor's mouth moved in the way it did when something struck her as both true and absurd. It wasn't quite a smile. It never quite made it all the way to a smile. But it was the closest thing, and he'd learned to recognize it the way you learn to read weather, not as a symbol, but as a fact with its own specific meaning. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. They stood on the porch in the early light and looked at what it had left. A world repacked and reshaped, familiar shapes made unfamiliar under 3 feet of new snow, the sky above it a clean, cold blue that Wyoming produced after hard weather, as if in apology. It was beautiful in the impersonal way of landscapes that don't care whether you find them beautiful or not. We'll need to check the east fence line, Eleanor said. The creek, too. Jam will be building early this year. I'll go tomorrow if the temperature holds. He looked at her in the early light, the cut on her cheek, the practical way she was already cataloging what the storm had cost and what needed doing, the absolute absence in her of any expectation that the world was going to be easy or fair or arranged for her convenience. Eleanor, he said. She turned. I'd like to come with you. Not to help, just to come. She looked at him for a moment. Those are the same thing. They're not, he said. Helping is about the task. Coming is about the other thing. She held his gaze. Then, yes, she said, come. Amos took the news of the new arrangement between the ranches with the particular equanimity of a 19-year-old who had suspected this was coming for months and was relieved it was finally settled. He told his mother in a letter that Miss Ashcroft and Mr. Hayes had worked out some kind of partnership, and that he thought it was a good thing because they were both better at the operation when the other one was around, and that was worth something in his estimation. His mother, a practical woman, agreed. The valley received the news the way it received most things, with an initial period of discussion followed by the rapid absorption of the fact into the ongoing reality of life. Pete Gunderson said he'd seen it coming since January. Martha said Pete had not seen it coming since January and was revising history, which was accurate. Bill Harker rode over in May to drop off a piece of equipment he'd borrowed the previous fall, stayed for coffee, and said to Coulter with complete directness, "Good. She needed someone who wouldn't manage her, and you needed someone who wouldn't let you." Coulter didn't argue with any part of this. Clara Gunderson, when she heard, wrote in her journal that it was the best thing to happen in the valley since she could remember, which was 17 years, which she acknowledged wasn't long but felt like enough from the inside. The fence between the two properties came down in the second week of May. This was Eleanor's idea, and Coulter had taken about 30 seconds to agree with it, not the property boundary. That remained exactly where it had always been, surveyed and documented, each ranch operating as its own legal and financial entity, as they'd agreed. But the fence itself, the physical posts and wire that divided the shared grazing land between the two north pastures, was unnecessary now that the cattle ran together under joint management. Taking it down would open 12 acres of excellent summer grazing that had been underused because of the division. They did it together over 2 days, Amos helping, pulling posts and rolling wire in the particular satisfying way of dismantling something that had outlived its purpose. Coulter knew how to read fence, which posts were still good and which had rotted at the base, which wire was worth keeping and which was past it. And Eleanor was learning fast, which she always was. Amos, who had grown up with fence work, took the wire rolling with the efficiency of someone who'd done it since childhood. On the second afternoon, they pulled the last post, the corner post that had been the meeting point of the two properties, the original boundary marker. It came out of the ground stiffly, like it had opinions about being removed, and Coulter stood it upright and looked at the hole it left. "That's been in the ground since before Frank bought the property," he said. "His uncle put it there." Eleanor looked at the post, then at the open ground where it had stood. "Should we keep it?" "What for?" "So we remember what this was." She took it from his hands and leaned it against the remaining fence line. Before and after. Both things are true. He looked at her. "You're a strange person," he said, which had become, over a year, approximately the highest compliment he knew how to give. "Yes," she said simply, and picked up her tools. The summer the two ranches ran together was the most productive either operation had seen in years. Not because the combination was magic. It wasn't. It was work. It was the same daily physical negotiation with a landscape that didn't offer anything for free, but because two people managing a shared operation with mutual respect and without ego, covering each other's gaps, turned out to be significantly more effective than either of them alone. Coulter knew the deep land, the patterns of decades, where the water was in dry years and where the pasture went weak in cold ones. Eleanor knew the systems, the record-keeping, the planning, the connections between things that revealed themselves when you documented them long enough. Together they covered ground that neither of them reached independently. There were disagreements. That needed saying, because the disagreements were real and sometimes lasted longer than was comfortable. In August, they argued for 4 days about the best approach to expanding the cattle operation. Coulter wanted to go slower. Eleanor thought the pasture could support more than either of them was using, and that caution was costing them income. He thought she was being optimistic. She thought he was using caution as a way to avoid risk, which she said directly and which landed hard because it was partially true. They worked it out through the same process they'd always worked things out, by both of them being willing to stay in the room with the discomfort until they got to something more accurate than their starting positions. In the end, they split the difference, not as a compromise in the weak sense, but as a genuine synthesis, adding 15 head instead of Eleanor's 20 or Coulter's 8. She was right about the pasture. The land supported it without stress. He told her so. "You could have let me find out I was wrong," she said. "You weren't wrong." "I might have been, but you weren't." He looked at her. "I'm working on telling people when they're right. It's slower going than I'd like." "I noticed," she said, "you're better than you were." High praise. "Yes," she said, with the corner of the mouth movement. "I thought so." Fall came again with its brief, cold beauty. The anniversary of Eleanor's arrival, a full year on Frank's land, her land, passed on a Wednesday in early October without ceremony, which was how she wanted it. She noted it in the ledger the way she noted everything: the date, the weather, the state of the operation, and in the margin, in the smaller writing she used for observations rather than facts. 1 year. 12 head became 27. 4 pages of fence notes became 40. The creek runs clear. Matilda is still complaining. The corner post is leaning against the north fence, and I have not decided what to do with it yet. She did not write what else had changed in a year, because that kind of accounting didn't belong in a ledger. It belonged in the part of a person that doesn't need to be documented to be true. Coulter came for supper that Wednesday evening, which was their usual pattern now, and they ate at the table with Amos, who had become a fixture in the way that good people in good situations tend to become fixtures, steady and unquestioning in his presence. After Amos went home, Eleanor poured coffee and sat across from Coulter and said, "A year." "A year," he agreed. Frank would have been insufferably pleased with himself, she said. Coulter thought about Frank, about the letters and the journals, and the specific quality of a man who left his land to a niece he knew could handle it and trusted that Wyoming and time would do the rest of the work he couldn't do from the grave. He would have said he knew all along, Coulter said, and he would have been mostly right, which would have been the most irritating part. Eleanor smiled, really smiled. Not the almost smile, the actual one, which she still didn't deploy casually, and which still, when it came, was worth everything it cost to get there. "He wrote it, actually," she said, "in the last entry of the last journal, September, 2 months before he died. He wrote, 'I believe Eleanor will be all right here. She has what the land respects, which is not strength exactly, but a willingness to be exactly who you are in the middle of difficulty. The valley will figure her out eventually. So will Hayes, if he's paying attention.'" Coulter sat with this for a moment. Frank's voice in it was exact, the dry patience of a man who observed everything and said most of it sideways. "He never told me he thought that." "No, he wrote it." "Paper for facts," Coulter said. Apparently that counted as a fact. He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them, Frank's lamp, Eleanor's lamp now, threw its warm, uncertain light. Outside, the early October wind was doing the thing it did every fall, testing, probing, reminding the valley that it hadn't gone anywhere. In a few weeks, the first serious cold would come, then the snow, then the long, hard, necessary winter that asked everything of the people who chose to live inside it and gave back exactly what you put in, and not one thing more. "I've been thinking," Coulter said. "About what?" "About the property line. The legal one, not the fence." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "I don't want to change it. You were right about that from the start. Both ranches stay as they are. Both of us keep what we own. That's not what I'm thinking about." Eleanor waited, which was her way of telling him to continue. "I'm thinking about the work of it," he said. "The formal partnership, written down. What's mine, what's yours, what's shared, how decisions get made." He looked at her steadily. "Not because I don't trust you, because I do, and trust deserves a structure that doesn't depend on everyone staying healthy and reasonable and alive." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He could see her turning it over, looking at the practical dimensions, the same way she looked at everything. "Frank always said the best arrangements were the ones that could survive a bad year," she said. "Frank was right about most things." "He was right about most things," she agreed. She looked at him. "You're not asking me to merge the properties. I'm asking to formalize what we're already doing, with clear terms, so that if one of us gets sick or makes a bad decision or dies, the other one is protected." He paused. "And so that what we're building has a shape that lasts beyond the two of us being in the same room to hold it together." She sat with this for long enough that a less patient man might have filled the silence. Coulter had learned patience, or perhaps he'd always had it, and she'd taught him where to point it. "Draw up the terms," she said finally. "We'll go through them together. Anything I disagree with, we negotiate. That's how I'd want to do it." "Good." She picked up her coffee. "I'll warn you. I'll disagree with at least 2 things on principle, regardless of what they are. I need you to understand that going in." He looked at her. "On principle. I've spent my entire adult life having other people decide the terms of things that involved me. I need the practice of negotiating, even when I might have agreed with the original terms." She met his eyes with the direct, unmanaged honesty that he had stopped finding surprising and started finding necessary. "Is that acceptable?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "It's more than acceptable. It's exactly right." She nodded, satisfied, and they finished their coffee in the comfortable quiet that had been one of the real gifts of the year. The discovery that two people who talked as plainly as they did were also capable of easy silence, which meant the talking came from genuine need rather than social anxiety. When he rode home that night, the first frost of fall was silvering the grass. The stars were out in their October configuration, bright and indifferent and exactly where they'd always been. Trick moved through the familiar dark with the settled ease of a horse that knows this road completely, and Coulter rode without directing, just present in the night, thinking about the shape of things. He thought about the corner post leaning against the north fence and what it meant to keep it. The before, acknowledged, not erased. He thought about two ledgers in two different handwritings covering the same land from different angles, which was better than one ledger covering it from one. He thought about the particular stubbornness of a woman who moved cattle 2 days before she was told to because 11 years of journals were more reliable than someone else's schedule, and who was right about it, and who didn't need anyone to tell her she was right to be sure of it. He thought about Frank, who had known. The valley below him was dark and winter patient, the way it always was in October, gathering itself for what was coming. The Ashcroft Ranch was a light to the east. Eleanor still up, probably still at the table, probably still writing in the ledger or reading something she'd ordered through Pete Gunderson's catalog, because she was always learning something and she'd never once in a year stopped long enough to believe she knew everything she needed to know. That quality, more than any other, more than the strength or the stubbornness or the precision, was what Coulter had come to understand was the center of her. The willingness to remain a student of the place she'd chosen, the honest accounting of what she knew and what she still needed to learn, and the absence of shame in that accounting. He'd spent 4 years after Sarah believing that loving someone and losing them meant the best thing to do was to need less, to build the walls tighter, to become more capable and less dependent until the space inside the walls was so efficiently managed that nothing could get in to disorder it again. Eleanor had not argued with this exactly. She'd just lived differently in front of him for a year until the evidence accumulated past the point where the old story could hold its shape. 2 ranches, 2 sets of deeds, 2 people who had come to this valley separately and built separately and would maintain separately because that was right and they both knew it was right. And between those 2 separate things, a shared operation and a shared table, and the daily choice to stand beside rather than in front of, to trust rather than to manage, to say plainly what was true rather than what was safe. It was not a perfect thing. It would never be a perfect thing. There would be bad seasons and genuine disagreements, and the accumulated difficulty of 2 people with strong convictions trying to work inside a framework of mutual respect rather than mutual accommodation. There would be days when the work was brutal, and the weather was worse, and one or both of them would fail at something they'd expected to do well. The land would keep asking, the way it always asked, with no regard for readiness. But they would be there when it asked. Both of them, together, each on their own ground, which was the only way the answer was worth giving. In the spring they would take the old corner post, the one Eleanor had leaned against the north fence because she thought both the before and the after were worth keeping, and they would set it at the entrance to the combined operation, not as a boundary marker, but as a reference point, something to orient by. A reminder that the most solid things were the ones that had already survived being tested. Amos would tell his mother it was the most practical piece of sentiment he'd ever seen, which his mother would agree was the best kind. Matilda, for her part, would continue to have opinions about the weather and the quality of the hay and the general state of Wyoming as a place to live. And Eleanor would continue to listen to them with the patient seriousness they deserved, because that was who she was. And Coulter Hayes, who had ridden to Ashcroft Ranch on a cold October morning, expecting to find a woman packing her bags, would go on being surprised, not by what Eleanor had built, because he'd seen that coming for long enough that it no longer qualified as surprise, but by the specific daily texture of a life that was fuller than the one he'd been managing alone. Not easier, fuller. Those were not the same thing, and he had finally stopped confusing them. The frontier did not soften for either of them. It never had, and it never would, and neither of them wanted it to. What the frontier offered, what it had always offered to the people willing to meet it honestly, was the chance to find out exactly who you were when the comfortable options ran out. Eleanor Ashcroft had known who she was from the first swing of the axe. Coulter Hayes had taken a year to remember. That seemed, in the end, like enough.
Yeah, we made like nothing, bro. Holy. Well, we made quota, so that's fine. Let's go sell our stuff, guys. Hello, guys.
Hey.
Is everyone bored of this game or something?
I'm just tired, boss. It's almost 1 AM for me.
Shut up!
Dude, a fucking turret started shooting at me and I was like avoiding it and it wouldn't stop shooting. Like it literally didn't stop shooting. I closed the door and I just instantly died.
Dude, I heard it through the wall.
Yeah.
It wouldn't stop. It was literally shooting for like 5 seconds straight. And it wasn't hitting me, so I was like, okay, I can close this door and hopefully I won't die. And I just instantly died the second I closed the door.
Who has the tragedy mask? I heard it.
Me.
Just making sure you're not getting silly.
I couldn't I? It's too late. I've casted them into the fire.
Chandler has experienced the tragedy mask.
Better that way. See how much that is. See if we can save anything. Perfect, we hit quota. Alright, you guys got everything? Everyone's in the ship? Alright, let's go. Alright, should we go to Rend? Oh wait, Ben's not on the ship.
Somebody's on the ship.